Is that working, Brandon?
Yeah, good to go.
All right, everyone. Thanks for traveling out here. There's tons of new faces. I'm glad to see everybody. We're going to be talking about Emulsify 2.0. The idea is that it's component-driven development, and the core behind it is Pattern Lab. So if you're familiar with Pattern Lab, you're going to have some familiarity here. My name is Chris Martin. I'm known by CCJJ Martin pretty much everywhere. That's my email on multiple places, Twitter, GitHub, everything. I'm currently a support engineer at 4Kitchens, so that's going to be my perspective. Generally, I just kind of touch the surface of a lot of subjects. If you're looking for a more in-depth presentation, we'll have those available on the 4Kitchens website. We're doing a whole mini-series on Emulsify where we have multiple developers. We each picked a topic. We gave a presentation. In particular, if you look at our blog, you should find at least 2 of them that have been published. And we're going to have another one that dives into specific parts of Emulsify. This is going to be more of like a high-level general overview. So what are we going to talk about today? I'm going to very briefly cover component-driven development in regards to like the basics of what you have to know to get started with Emulsify. I'm going to talk about some specifics on Emulsify's component-driven development as to like how we actually implement it. Then I'm going to talk about getting started with Emulsify if you want to set up your first project, what you need to know. We're going to talk about how to connect it to Drupal because, as I mentioned, it is driven by Pattern Lab. So designers don't actually have to set up Drupal to work with Emulsify, which is a positive. After that, I'm going to move on to the new features in Emulsify 2.0. Online, you can find our 1.0 presentation, but 2.0 has 4 new features that I think you all will be happy with. I'm going to very briefly cover some of the topics we've been looking at for Emulsify 3.0. We actually have other ideas for versions 4 and 5 and things like that, but we're just going to go one at a time. Then after that, we're going to actually dive into a demo that I set up. So it's a very basic setup of Emulsify. It's a gallery in particular. I like galleries as an example because there's a million different ways to build a gallery in Drupal. So that's just my thing. And then at the very end, we'll talk about some tips and additional resources that you can look into to dive in a little bit deeper. I like to use NVM. So these are things that you should have installed on your computer to just kind of make your life easier. NVM is a node version manager. You should also be familiar with BEM, which is the block element modifier CSS methodology. I will very briefly cover like what BEM is, and then I'll talk about what we did in Emulsify to make that experience better. I'm also going to talk about some basics of Pattern Lab. Or no, you should have knowledge of basics of Pattern Lab. I believe we had a talk 3 months ago or so. You can look that up if you want to dive in deeper there. Then I would expect you should know Drupal 8 theming and some basic command line knowledge. So there was a presentation probably 4 or 5 months ago on component-driven development. You should look into that. And if you haven't already dove in, component-driven development is going to make your life easier because it standardizes your site. In particular, if you've looked at Pattern Lab before, you'll see that everything is a component. You have components within components. And from my perspective as a maintenance developer, that makes my life much easier because I change the code in one place and I know that across the site, everything got the same change. We don't have like these weird one-off things that I have to go and look for and debug. So it makes it very easy to maintain. It's also easily portable. So when you think about your design, you want to make sure that it can go to any backend. And so one of the positives of Emulsify is that you can actually hook it up to Drupal 8. You could hook it up to WordPress. Theoretically, you could hook it up to Drupal 7 if somebody went through and built that integration. So all of these are pretty much, they're independent of the front end. And the thing that's going to be my favorite is that it's easy to remove a component. In particular, that's going to be the advantages of BEM, is that all of your CSS is contained to just that component. And when you remove it, you don't have to worry about other components being affected. I like to talk about some hidden benefits that you might not think about, is that the developer's job is going to be made easier because you're going to be spending more time in the design phase. So you're going to be talking upfront with clients. You're going to be figuring out exactly what they want, and you're going to be doing it fairly quickly in regards to having a prototype that they can look at and interact with, so that later you haven't installed a whole bunch of Drupal modules that you have to go through and uninstall, or change your whole foundation simply because upfront they wanted to change one of the requirements on one of the components. And so one of the things I would say is a positive is that designers don't actually have to set up Drupal, because a lot of people have problems setting up Drupal. I think we all know about the Drupal learning curve. There's a lot of things you have to learn. Drupal 8 made it that much worse, where you have to figure out all of these new foundational tools to get it up and running. So now if you have somebody that knows just HTML and CSS, they can come in and build the front end, and then someone else can come in later and connect it to the back end. So I really like that. I'm calling this a disadvantage of component-driven development, and that would be you're going to spend a lot more time in your design phase. I think this is actually a positive, though, because when you spend more time in the design phase, you're going to save a lot of effort on the back end. Right? You don't have to rebuild everything. So let's talk about Emulsify's component-driven development. We're going to talk about Pattern Lab, how Pattern Lab is a living style guide, and then we're going to briefly touch BEM. Let's see. I'm going to go ahead and pull this up. All right, so if anyone has never seen Pattern Lab before, this is your living style guide. And I use the word living because this code actually gets executed on the live site. So everything you see here is going to be on your live site, and that's why it's living. You can, as you see here, we have our base components, and then we move up to what's called atoms and molecules and organisms, templates and pages. Each one of these is a category of components. And if I just take a look at our example page here, here we have our component. You can tell, if you just kind of imagine each square is a component, then you think about what actually goes into that component. Are there other components within it? Here we have an image, a title, a subtitle. We have some paragraphs. So when you're going through your design, build your wireframes, figure out what you're going to name things, spend a lot of time talking with the client, and do this right up front so that later it makes your life easier. If we take a look at some atoms, atoms are your smallest components. So here we're looking at the very basic markup that you would see on a page. You're not looking at a higher level component that includes other components. You're actually looking at the markup that gets generated. And I think that's about all I'm going to dive into Pattern Lab. There's tons of information out there if you want to dive further in. The documentation will tell you how to get started, what additional features you can look into, what to name these things. You can create variations of your components. You can just dive in and do all sorts of crazy things. The thing that I want to touch on before I move on, though, is that Pattern Lab is a design system. So what you're doing is you're building your entire design from the ground up, which, if you're familiar with Bootstrap, right, you're building your own Bootstrap is the way to think about it. So I would spend a lot of time thinking about each one of these because it will have a chain reaction later. All right, so here's going to be our very brief overview of BEM. BEM is a CSS methodology, and it's basically a naming convention. And the good thing about BEM is that it makes your CSS very contained, and it's not leaking out into other areas that it shouldn't be, right? So actually, if you're familiar with Sass nesting, you're basically getting rid of nesting if you're doing it right. Like, you don't nest anything. You just have your top level card in our first case here, and then it contains the basic CSS for your card. Then, so your block, if you think about it as your component, right? It's your whole square, if I was thinking about a component as a square. And then within that, you would have other components. And in this case, we have our element, which is card image. And so within the card earlier you saw graphs. So each one of those would be an element. You'd have card image, card title, card subtitle, and card paragraph. That's how the elements would go. And then you have modifiers, which enables you to do things like variations, where it's like, okay, I want my image to be floated on the left on this particular card, or floated on the right, or something like that. I want it to be large versus small. You come in there and you put in a modifier, and then that's going to lead me right into Emulsify 1.0 had more of a pseudo BEM methodology, in that we basically cleaned it up in version 2. And if you look here, what you would see is that your element was actually its own class. So sometimes you saw element names as classes. You could target it by that. We found out that was not the best way and most ideal way to do it. So stick with your BEM with block and element, because it keeps it contained. So yeah, we were definitely doing a lot of different things with the CSS names, and we've changed that in version 2. And we like what we're doing in version 2, so we're going to stick with that. All right, and now we're going to get started with Emulsify. I picked this picture because this person looks really motivated, and you need to be really motivated if you're going to move forward with Emulsify. You're going to be building everything from the ground up. It is not meant to be a ready-to-go theme. It is meant to be, you take Emulsify as an example theme, and then you create your own, and it's not a sub-theme, it's just you create your own fork of Emulsify at that point. Now, you can choose to use all of the existing components within Emulsify, but you could also choose to just start from scratch. If you're doing something like this with Emulsify, you're probably going to be starting from scratch. So you're just going to wipe everything, start with a clean slate. If you're testing it out and playing with it, go ahead and play with the example components. But let's see. All right, let's talk about the structure of a basic component. Within Pattern Lab, you have a patterns folder. This is where all of your components live. And then underneath that, you have your types of components. This is your atoms, your molecules, your organisms, your templates, and your pages. Underneath that, you're actually going to have your pattern name. You could also have groups of patterns if you choose to do that. One of the things that you'll see is that the components will occasionally have numbers in front of them. You'll see like a 00 image, 01 link. The only reason we put numbers in front of it is so that when you're on your style guide, you see the components in that order. Then within your pattern name directory, you're going to have all of your pattern files. This is great because everything's contained, right? It's like, okay, all of the code that's generating this particular component on my website is right here. I don't have to go hunting around for it. It's right there. You're going to have your Twig files. I'm not diving into Twig. There's a lot of information out there if you want to dive into that, figure out how to use it. You have your SAS files. As I mentioned, you really shouldn't be nesting anything if you're using BEM properly. You have your JavaScript files, which we do have Gulp aggregating everything. And so that's how it's working right now, is it grabs all of your JS files and aggregates them. Your MD file is going to be your descriptive information about the component. If anyone's familiar with Jekyll and a lot of their header information, it uses the same concept there so that you can come in and like change the name of your component, etc. The YAML file I'm going to briefly touch because I think it's actually very important. I think that if you spend a good amount of time thinking about your YAML files, then you're going to end up with a better result at the end. Because the way that I think about it is your YAML file is really the connector between like your front end and your back end, right? So if you're thinking about parameters being passed to a function, these would be your parameters. And then you could have variations of your YAML files. For instance, if you have a card, you might want to have a card with a gray background. And so you would create a variation of like pattern name, gray, and then you would come in and make your changes as to what you would pass over.
You ever have any variations on the Twig file or template itself?
I want to say that might be possible, but it'd probably be better to just create another pattern at that point. So that's what I would go with there. The YAML files are really geared towards you're passing different parameters to the same function, if you kind of think about it like that. All right, so I've kind of been talking about the YAML files here. I gave an example. If you wanted to navigate to this link, you could go see specifically. I pointed out, see if I can open that. Great. All right, so within, bigger?
Yeah.
How are we doing?
Oh, it's better.
Readable?
Yeah,
okay. All right, within your YAML file, or this is your Twig file. So I had it on the YAML page, but I meant Twig. At the top of it, you should be documenting the available parameters that can be passed into your Twig file. I like the documentation that this adds here because within your style guide, you can actually go through and view the documentation. Right? So if you were demoing this to a client, or if you're talking to a backend developer, you can come in here and say, oh, our unordered lists, needs to be able to pass a new parameter. I'm going to come in here and, take a look at what is available and then figure out what I need to pass. So your Twig file is actually right here, if you didn't want to have to go through and dig through the code to find it. One of the things that we could definitely do better at in the Emulsify project is the documentation. When I was originally planning on talking about this, I was thinking about saying that people could jump into the project and contribute by just looking at this documentation thing and helping us make sure we documented all the parameters. I'm later going to tell you that you should wait a little while to do that, but we're definitely looking for contributors to the project. Everything is obviously open sourced, so if you see something you don't like, feel free to change it. And let's go back to the presentation. Yeah, so your YAML file passes the data into the Twig file, and that's what actually generates on your Pattern Lab style guide. And then later, Drupal bypasses your YAML files and delivers whatever Drupal tells it to. So atoms are your most basic component. Atoms are almost fully going to be markup, and that's all you're going to see within it. Once you start getting above atoms, you're going to start seeing includes, right? So you'll have components within components if you did it right, even at the molecule level, right? So if you wanted to potentially look at ways to refactor your project to make it better, if you're putting markup other than a wrapper within your molecules, you should probably refactor it as an atom. But then the ways to include other components within like your molecules or organisms, your higher level components, there's 3 ways. You can do an include, you can do extends, or you can do embed. So include will pull in a file and replace your variables. I'm going to dive in the next few slides deeper into how each one of these works. Extends will pull in a file and replace blocks, and embed will pull in a file and replace variables and or blocks. So let's take a look at an include. If you were on a higher level organism, you're going to include, like in our molecule example, you're going to include an atom. So what it looks like is include your atom, and then you have to specify the exact path from your atoms folder to your Twig file, the one that you want to include. And then the key with the includes is that with statement. So you're going to say with all of these variables. And in our case here, these variables could be passed from the YAML file. Like the card link text, you would actually define that within your YAML file. But then if you were defining it from Drupal, you're also going to define that from Drupal. And then you can have one name that's passed into your Twig file, and you can have another name that's passed into your included component. So in our case, card link text is being changed into link content. This particular example also shows you that Twig gives you the ability to pass a default parameter. So if your YAML file did not define a parameter, then you can pass one. And it could be, as you can see in our example, another parameter like card-based class, or it could be a string like link. And so like when you're defining classes, if you need a special class, you can come in here and pass a default. Extends is available. However, in practice, you're not going to use it. It's just not going to be something you use because you're always going to want to either pass a variable or rebuild a block. So here's an embeds. I'm sorry if this is a little small. I think this is a bit as big as I can make it. The difference is that with an embed, you can pass variables and you can replace a block. Blocks, I think, are super powerful within Twig because if you take the time to refactor your components properly and include blocks, you can replace only one. So in our card example earlier, we had an image, a title, a subtitle, and a paragraph. Let's say the only difference between one of your components and this new requirement is that the image needs to pass some new attribute, or the markup on your atom has to change in some way that a variable just can't handle. Well, you can actually replace that entire set of markup with a block. So you would define the block within your lower level component, and then you replace the block in your higher level component. And that's embeds. So everything we've talked about so far is within Pattern Lab. Like I said, designers can work within Pattern Lab. They don't ever have to set up Drupal. Now we're going to kind of very briefly here talk about, in theory, how you connect it to Drupal, and then later we'll look at some application. But when you think about connecting it to Drupal, I want you to think about the templates directory, because that's the directory that you actually override your Drupal templates. If you're familiar with Drupal theming, everything is regular here. You find a template, you overwrite it, and then in your override, you pass it over to your Pattern Lab component. I don't have a slide for it, but one of the little bits of magic that makes this all work is the components module within Drupal 8. So a dependency of Emulsify is the components module. And that allows you to define your atoms directory within Pattern Lab, your molecules directory within Pattern Lab, etc. So that's how it finds it. We also have another little bit of Emulsify magic behind the scenes. We have a dependency on the unified Twig extensions module. And what that does is it allows you to create functions within Pattern Lab that you can use within Drupal. So we created two functions. We created the BEM function and the add attributes function. I'm going to dive into those later. So now let's dive into some Drupal integration. It's super basic. All you have to do is think about, like, plugging a plug into a socket. You know that you have Drupal passing variables into your template file, and you just process those into whatever variable names needs to be passed into Pattern Lab. That's all that's going on here. So you can use the include or embeds, as we were talking about. Pass whatever variables you need. You're probably going to see a little bit of what I would call, I guess I'd call it pre-processing, but in reality what it is it's identifying the exact variable name that you want to pass into Pattern Lab. So you'll have your crazy long strings that you're used to seeing within Drupal, where you have your base variable, some array, some object. You might have language, whatever, and then the value, and you would pass that over to Pattern Lab. Let me see. Yeah, so here you could pass a string constant, or you could pass a variable. This is something that I'm looking for community feedback on. Emulsify is still fairly new. We're still looking for best practices. I would like to hear about how y'all are using Emulsify on your projects, and I would like to see, where are you actually putting your Drupal fields? Are those atoms? Are they molecules? Where are you actually putting it? So in the example that I created, I had fields as an atom, I had nodes as a molecule, and I had views as an organism. In actual practice, you're not going to see templates or pages hooked up to Drupal, because that's really the whole purpose of Drupal, right? So Drupal is what delivers your page, right? We're not wanting Pattern Lab to deliver the page to the user. I do like pages, though, because they are a very quick prototyping tool. So if your client needs to see what the end goal is going to look like, that is a very quick way, without having to do anything in Drupal, to show them what it's going to look like, and then they can change their mind. You might change your entire layout. They might be like, oh, well, I now want a left sidebar after I've seen what it looks like, and I want to add these other components. So I would highly recommend you set up pages, even though the only place that they're ever going to be used is within Pattern Lab. And definitely hit me up later and let me know how you're using it. So in Emulsify 2.0, we created 4 new features to make your life easier. We have a DRUSH install script for your scaffolding purposes. Earlier when I was talking about, you can choose to either include all of the Emulsify components if you wanted to get started with what we have, or you can actually choose to start from scratch. The DRUSH install script will get you there. We have Composer install now, so that makes your life a lot easier because Drupal 8's using Composer, so now we do too. I've briefly mentioned our BEM and our attributes functions, and we're going to dive into those. So as I mentioned, we have a DRUSH install script now. If you're using Drupal 8 and you haven't upgraded to 8.4.0 yet, you're going to have to now start using DRUSH 9. DRUSH 8 is like literally broken. There's an issue out there that says they're not going to fix DRUSH 8. You just have to upgrade to DRUSH 9. So go ahead and upgrade to DRUSH 9 as soon as you can. I was using Dev Desktop, so I have an alias here. And then if you type help Emulsify, you'll see all of the options that are available within our Emulsify script. So DRUSH Emulsify is what you would type, and then that will install your fork of Emulsify. I would just recommend, typing the help, looking at all the options, figuring out what best suits you. The slim option, SLIM, is what you use to start from scratch if you don't want all of the base components from Emulsify. A little bit later when we dive into some actual application, if you wanted to use Composer to set up just an Emulsify project without Drupal, you can do that. So that's our standalone install command right there. And then right after that, I list how to install Emulsify into an existing project. So it's just, the regular Composer require for Kitchen's Emulsify. And our BEM function is something I'd like to talk with you all about how it makes your life easier. All right, so this is our actual BEM function. It is actually not within the Emulsify repository. If you want to include this within your own project that's not Emulsify, you can do that. I would recommend if you want to use BEM on another theme that's not Emulsify, definitely look at using this function because we've put in a lot of hard work to making it work properly, and that you can pass it a base class, which is actually going to be your element name in this case. You can pass it modifiers, as many as you want, and it will spit out a class for each modifier. And then the block name, in our case, is actually what you would call the block name in the BEM syntax. So our BEM function does pass 3 parameters, but they are not the BEM of BEM. So that's something you should be aware of, is that it's actually more like element modifiers block because of which ones you're more likely to use. Because most of the time your block name will be defaulted within your Twig file, and you just won't have to pass it into BEM. You probably will want to override the base class and the modifiers, which is why they're first. And so here we have a bunch of code that goes through and generates your classes. And this right here is gold. We got it to where Pattern Lab works with Drupal And in particular, it works with the Drupal attributes class. So if you've been digging around in Drupal 8, you know there's an attributes class that goes into generating all of your different components. And this little bit of code right here connects Pattern Lab and Drupal together, which did not work out of the box before. We can thank Evan and Jeff for their hard work on this function. All right, and let's see, I think I had thought about diving into looking at the BEM function, I think at that level, but I'm going to pass that and we're going to look at this. All right, so you actually saw the BEM function code, like the magic behind what makes it work. You know, it's not part of Emulsify, but when you do a composer require or when you do a essentially like composer install, it will pull the BEM function into your project for you. We set up all of our post-install scripts and everything to just make that work. So our composer work really streamlined the install process. It made it, I think, 3 commands shorter than it was before to get Emulsify up and running. We can thank Brian Lewis for that. And then coming back to our BEM function though, this is how you're going to use BEM within a Twig file. You're not actually going to pass the class names. You're not actually going to pass your link modifiers in the sense of that they're like strings. They're variables that you set either in your YAML file or they're coming from Drupal. Most likely though, you're going to see it in the top of your Twig file as like a set this variable to this parameter, which is passed in from YAML or Drupal, or this default, which in our case, like if it's not passed, we're going to pass link as the base class. All right, and so that's BEM. You can pretty much copy and paste this. The BEM function is great because it made Emulsify more dry. Don't repeat yourself. Before, we were copying and pasting a lot of boilerplate code, and now that actually looks nice. Before, it was like this 3-line wrapped function with like, if this, do this, and create this class and add this, and now we've actually made it to where it's maintainable also because me as a maintenance developer, I don't want to have to go through and edit every single template if I change the logic on how classes are generated, right? If I want to change the logic on how classes are generated, I want to do it once across my whole project. All right, and I mentioned that you should namespace your BEM parameters, and earlier you saw, let me see if this has an example. Yeah, so what you'll see within our components is you'll see that every variable within the components is namespaced in that, you know, it has the component name underscore element even within our variables. At some point, you're probably going to have the thought to yourself, oh, well, for like a heading, why do I need, you know, heading 1? Why don't I just pass, you know, block name? Why is it that every single block name has to be namespaced? And the issue that we ran into was that when you don't namespace your parameters, lower level components get those parameters too. So the higher level component would pass, you know, organism name, URL, and then if you had a URL at the organism level and at the molecule level, they're going to conflict with each other, and you're going to end up with, you know, the wrong thing being generated on your lower level components. So that's why when you're naming your variables within your template file, you should namespace it. All right, and so you saw attributes within BEM. That was one of the things we did a lot of hard work on. But we also now have an add attributes function, which allows you to create attributes in both Pattern Lab and Drupal. So a link is a really good example of attributes, and that you're going to have your href, your source, whatever else might be in there, and you want to pass those in specifically. So now we've made that easier, and we made it dry so that there's one function that generates it, and if you need to change the logic behind it to fix a bug, it's only in one place. So our add attributes function has a lot of magic going on. And I don't have an example here that we'll look at, but later in our example, we'll dig into it. But it would give you the ability to pass the exact attributes that are going into your markup on the component. And so you can pass any attribute you want. All right. And Emulsify 3.0, what do we have planned next? Basically, it is a complete overhaul of the project, right? So we've learned a lot. We've had version 1, we've had version 2. In version 2, we basically just broke everything. We have it out there now. We did go through, as I mentioned, we have BEM in most of our example components, but as I also mentioned, you're still going to find some components within Emulsify that are still using like the 1.0 code. They're not using our BEM and add attributes functions in particular. So if you're creating new components, make sure you're using those, even though our examples might not be up to date. But that's what we're doing in 3.0. We're getting everything up to date. We're fixing it. We're using everything we've learned. I think we've done at least 3 full projects with it now, and we learned on each one of those. So what we've learned there, we're going to give back in 3.0.
Are they being built to be backward compatible?
Nope. So this is a theme. And as I mentioned, the DRUSH script forks it, right? So you're forking it at a specific point in time. There basically is no upgrade path on Emulsify, right? You are building a design system from scratch, and we're just providing examples on how to do it. So when you think about Emulsify, it is an example project. It is not a ready-to-go theme. Like if you're using Emulsify, you're the type of person that wants to build it from scratch because you need complete customization of your theme. All right, so if you want to grab some pizza, go ahead and take a break, grab a drink. I'm going to pull up some other information for the example coming up.